Welcome back, everyone. It was meant to come out a few weeks ago, but idiot that I am, I forgot to turn down the background music, so the video was completely ruined, so now I'm recording it. In a previous episode, I argued that the main focus of Wuthering Heights isn't the love story, and in this video I want to focus on what I think is the main theme in the story. Ultimately, I'll be arguing that Wuthering Heights is a story about revenge and forgiveness. Part 1. Forgiveness, the true love of Wuthering Heights. In my opinion, the true love of Wuthering Heights is not the love between Catherine and Heathcliff or any of the other characters, but instead it's the kind of love that allows people to forgive each other, even when we've done terrible things. It's also a story about how revenge is a terrible and destructive force that can cause damage not just to the person seeking revenge, but to everyone else around them. So at the start of the story, we have our framing narrative where Lockwood goes up to Wuthering Heights and spends the night there. This is the night where he sees Cathy's ghost, but I don't want to focus on Cathy's ghost in this episode. Instead, I want to focus on the dream sequence that Lockwood has just before he sees Catherine's ghost, because it's in this dream sequence that Bronte lays the foundations down for her themes of revenge and forgiveness. In Lockwood's dream, he's being guided to Thrushcross Grange by Joseph, who is the religious servant who lives at Wuthering Heights. Joseph in this dream chastises Lockwood for not bringing a staff with him onto the journey. A staff in this context is basically a symbol of going on a religious pilgrimage. If you're going on a pilgrimage, you might carry a staff with you. Joseph himself doesn't carry a staff. Instead, he has a club, which suggests violence quite clearly, and is a pretty good analogy for Joseph's character, because for all of his talk about piety and religion, he's one of the most aggressive and violent characters in the story. As always happens in dreams, Lockwood doesn't end up where he was intending to go, but instead he finds himself in a church. In this church, the Reverend Jabez Branderham is delivering a sermon about sins and forgiveness. And while he's listening to the Reverend talk, Lockwood suddenly remembers or thinks that either he, the preacher, or Joseph has committed the first of the 71st sin. The first of the 71st sin is a biblical allusion to Matthew in the New Testament. In this passage, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, comes to him and asks him how many times you should forgive a person if they've wronged you. Jesus then follows this by telling the story of a servant of a king who did something wrong and asked the king for forgiveness, and the king forgave him. But then, later on, someone who the servant knows does something wrong to the servant, and the servant refuses to forgive the man. When the king finds out about this, he punishes the servant for not being forgiving, and then Jesus basically says to Peter, if you don't learn this lesson, if you don't forgive, then the same punishment will happen to you. So the ultimate message of this passage is you should always forgive people. Unfortunately, Lockwood misinterprets this passage. He takes Jesus' line about the 70th sin literally, so he thinks that by committing the 71st sin, he's actually done something wrong, and so what Lockwood tries to do is blame it on the preacher. And then the preacher basically turns around and says, no, thou art the man, meaning you're the one who's committed the sin. And this is the sin of thinking that no sin was unforgivable. After this, the congregation goes into chaos and everyone gets their clubs out and they start trying to beat Lockwood. But actually, Lockwood finds himself unharmed, and instead it's everyone else in the church that starts getting hurt as they start beating each other up with clubs. Soon after this, Lockwood wakes up to the sound of a tree rattling against the window. This dream sequence is Bronte's way of conveying the message about revenge and forgiveness in the text. It shows how an unwillingness to forgive people their wrongs and a need to punish people for their wrongs ultimately is destructive. When the congregation all attacks Lockwood, they don't actually hurt Lockwood, they end up hurting each other. And so this is showing how if you don't forgive people and you just want to go into this punishing cycle of revenge, ultimately you're just going to hurt everyone else around you. So that's how Bronte sets up the main themes in this dream sequence. Now let's look at how these themes embody themselves in the characters. Which ones are the vengeful ones and what happens to them in the story, and which ones are the forgiving ones and what happens to them in the story. Part 2. Revenge. So most of the characters in Wuthering Heights, especially the characters in the first half of the book with the first generation, are very unforgiving people, and because of this, terrible things happen not only to them, but to everyone else. So let's look at some examples of this. Firstly, we've got our main offender, Heathcliff. So Heathcliff's whole character arc is built around his need for revenge, and then it follows the consequences of his revenge. Heathcliff is incapable of forgiving anyone for the wrongs that they've done him, even Catherine, and this ultimately will lead, or at least in part lead, to her death. Heathcliff pretty much sums up his own character arc early on in the story when he vows his revenge against Hindley for the abuses that Hindley has made him suffer. I'm trying to settle how I shall pay Hindley back. I don't care how long I have to wait, if I can only do it at last. I hope he will not die before I do. For shame, Heathcliff, said I. It is for God to punish wicked people. We should learn to forgive. No, God won't have the satisfaction that I shall, he returned. I only wish I knew the best way. Let me alone and I'll plan it out. While I'm thinking of that, I don't feel pain. This is a really good passage because it shows us that not only is Heathcliff unwilling to forgive Hindley and that he's already becoming consumed by his need for revenge, but it also shows that it's closing off Heathcliff's ability to empathise with people. He tells us that he doesn't feel pain while he's plotting his revenge. It's his way of coping, essentially, with the abuses that are being heaped off of him. But unfortunately, this way of coping will ultimately be destructive, not just to him, but to everyone else too. Catherine's character arc is very similar to Heathcliff's, although her way of having her revenge is slightly different. Catherine's ultimate sin is that she blames everyone else except for herself for her own circumstances. And because she does this, she then takes this out on everyone else, punishing them by starving herself and eventually killing herself, or at least contributing to her own death. And Catherine seems to revel in the fact that she's punishing others by punishing herself. When she's basically about to die because she's starved herself again, she says this to Edgar. What you touch at present you may have, but my soul will be on that hill before you lay hands on me again. Catherine blames Edgar and Heathcliff as well for breaking her heart, and in locking herself away and starving herself to a point where she'll die, she seems to be quite satisfied that this is going to be a great revenge on them. She knows that Edgar is going to suffer forever without her, and that to her is worth it. Catherine and Heathcliff are the most extroverted embodiments of revenge and forgiveness, but it isn't just these two characters that are incapable of forgiving either. Even Edgar Linton himself has this problem. At one point in the story, Edgar finds out that his sister Isabella is in love with Heathcliff, and he warns her that if she marries Heathcliff, then he will just disown her and never see her again. Now, of course, Isabella doesn't listen to this. She ends up marrying Heathcliff, and then when Edgar finds out, he does exactly what he says. He has nothing more to do with her. But this is a bad thing, because Isabella, as we find out, is suffering at Heathcliff's hands, and Edgar doesn't care. When a letter comes from Isabella telling him about the abuses she's suffering, he refuses to read it, and this is what he has to say. Forgiveness, said Linton. I have nothing to forgive her, Ellen. You may call at Wuthering Heights this afternoon, if you like, and say that I am not angry, but I am sorry to have lost her, especially as I can think she'll never be happy. It is out of the question my going to see her, however. We are eternally divided. So Edgar seems almost satisfied with Isabella's fate. She deserves it, and even though she is his sister, he's happy for her to reap the punishment that she's brought on herself because she didn't listen to him. And this ultimately ends up terrible for everyone involved, because Isabella and Heathcliff staying together means that Isabella will get pregnant and give birth to Linton, and then in the second generation, Linton will return and cause so much trouble and upheaval for Edgar and for his daughter. Ultimately, Edgar's unwillingness to forgive Isabella for her mistakes will cause suffering for people in the future. Part 3. Forgiveness. Most of the vengeful characters in Wuthering Heights are from the first generation, so to look at the more forgiving ones, we're going to have to look at the second generation of characters. And in this video, I'm going to focus on Cathy, young Cathy, and Hareton. Let's start with Cathy. So Cathy is a victim of Heathcliff's revenge. As part of this vengeance, Heathcliff contrives to get Cathy to marry his son, Linton, but meanwhile he's poisoning Linton's mind against Cathy so that once they marry, Linton will make Cathy suffer forever and ever. And also because if Linton marries Cathy, Linton will get access to all of Catherine's property and rights, and by proxy Heathcliff will get them because he is Linton's dad. When this is all revealed to Cathy, it's too late. She's already married. And so it would be very easy for her to slip into the cycles of revenge that everyone else has got into in the previous generation. But instead she doesn't do this, and she defies Heathcliff in a very important scene. Linton is all I have to love in the world, and though you have done what you could to make him hateful to me, and me to him, you cannot make us hate each other. And I defy you to hurt him when I am by, and I defy you to frighten me. I know he has a bad nature, said Catherine. He's your son, but I'm glad I've a better to forgive it, and I know he loves me, and for that reason I love him. Mr. Heathcliff, you have nobody to love you, and however miserable you make us, we shall still have the revenge of thinking that your cruelty arises from your greater misery. You are miserable, are you not? Lonely like the devil, and envious like him? Nobody loves you, nobody will cry for you when you die. I wouldn't be you. So this is a really important scene, because it shows that Cathy isn't willing to get involved in revenge. She does mention that her and Linton will have vengeance on Heathcliff, but she recognises that Linton, who she's now married to, is a pretty terrible person, but she's able to forgive him that, because she recognises that it's not really his fault, or at least in part, that he's become this embittered person that he is now. And it's Cathy's willingness to forgive Linton this that keeps her spirit alive, even while she's living a quite oppressed life with Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights. Now, she does mention having revenge against Heathcliff, but it's important to note the context there. She's saying that all the revenge she needs is knowing that Heathcliff is lonely and miserable and that he's ruined his own life. So what she's not doing here is she's not taking action to get revenge on Heathcliff. She recognises that just being Heathcliff is a punishment in and of itself, and that's enough to satisfy her. And that's why ultimately she'll be able to break the cycles of revenge. Hareton Earnshaw has a very similar arc to Cathy. His storyline follows Heathcliff's in many ways. Both Heathcliff and Hareton are abused as children and are left with nothing. But a big difference between Hareton and Heathcliff is that Hareton doesn't let the abuses that he suffers get him down. He doesn't become this embittered person who gets hell-bent on revenge. In fact, Hareton has such a good heart that when Heathcliff dies, he still cries at Heathcliff's funeral, and he's one of the only people to go to it. And this shows you how forgiving he is as a person. He knows that Heathcliff has wronged him by taking away Wuthering Heights from him and by treating him as a servant, but he's able to forgive Heathcliff for those bad things that he did, because he's able to empathise with Heathcliff. And this is why him and Cathy are the only people really left alive at the end of the story. Because they're able to forgive people for their sins, they're able to break the bitter cycles of revenge that have ruined and wiped out the previous generation. The theme of forgiveness is also embodied just in the relationship that Cathy and Hareton have together. When they're both living together at Wuthering Heights while Cathy is trapped there with Heathcliff, at first they really don't like each other. Hareton thinks that Cathy is snooty and up herself, and Cathy thinks that Hareton is just another Heathcliff Jr. mini-me type, and so they don't get on with each other. But ultimately, and with a little prodding from Nellie, they're able to look past their wrongful assumptions about each other. They're able to break the cycle because they come together in a kind of symbolic union, if you like, of Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. This union of theirs is also just really important because not only does it break the cycles of revenge for the future generations, but it also breaks the cycle of revenge that Heathcliff started. When Heathcliff sees that these two are coming together, his character suddenly changes. He starts to become more human again. He starts to feel, and ultimately he dies, leaving Cathy and Hareton to have a new, happy life, hopefully, at the Grange. Wuthering Heights, then, is a story about forgiveness. It's a story in which the characters who do cruel and terrible things to each other, all in the service of revenge, ultimately destroy their own lives and the lives of those that they love and care about. And ultimately, those characters that are able to look past this and forgive each other and move on and get over things and not just be stuck in the past are the characters that bring hope and that move forward. Only those characters who are brave enough to turn the other cheek are the ones who survive. Part 4. Old Testament versus New Testament. The theme of revenge and forgiveness can be, I think, put in a Christian context if you want. And I think it's quite important to mention this because there are certainly religious themes in the story, as we saw in the dream sequence that I talked about at the beginning. Now, the message of Wuthering Heights and religion is quite complex because Emily Bronte is clearly not wholly sympathetic to the cause of religion. We have the character of Joseph, who is the most pious character, and yet he's one of the most violent characters in the story. He's incredibly cruel and he's incredibly unforgiving to people. I think a character like Joseph is meant to represent the more fire and brimstone kind of justice that you get in the Old Testament, and that what Wuthering Heights seems to me to be doing is advocating for the more neighbour-loving and softer kind of justice that we get in the New Testament. So my interpretation of the religious themes in Wuthering Heights is essentially of a kind of battle between the Old Testament way of thinking and the New Testament way of thinking. In the Old Testament, you have this jealous God who is quite happy to just smite people down whenever they disobey him. He's unrelenting in his unforgivingness, and he even tells us to be unforgiving in our justice as well. Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he hath caused a blemish in man, so shall it be done to him again. So that's a passage from the Old Testament in Leviticus. But then you compare this to a passage from the New Testament, from Matthew again, and you have the exact opposite message. Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto ye, resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn him the other also. Ultimately, I don't think Wuthering Heights is a book that's against the Christian faith. I think that what Bronte is doing is noting two different dimensions to the Bible. You can take this revengeful approach to justice, or you can take a more forgiving approach, and it seems that Bronte is certainly in favour of the latter. That being said, one thing that makes Wuthering Heights such a great book is that it doesn't need to be interpreted along these religious lines. These themes of revenge and forgiveness apply to anyone. It doesn't matter if you buy into the Christian faith. If you're a vengeful person in the world of Wuthering Heights, then bad things are going to happen to you. It's not a good cycle to get into. And we all have the capacity to be vengeful, and Bronte is basically warning us against that impulse. And that to me makes it a great book, because if you've got a book that has some symbolic religious themes in it, but these themes can be abstracted into any context, then it just gives it that extra timeless quality that I think is always there in a great work. We all have an unforgiving side, and we all have the capacity to forgive, and for as long as we have these two sides of our character, Wuthering Heights is always going to have a lot of relevance for us. Okay, that's it for today's video. Let me know what you think of the things that I've said in this video. Do you think that revenge and forgiveness are a central theme in the story, or do you take there to be something else that's a central theme in the story? As always, I look forward to talking with you in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. But that's it for this video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!